Section 10 of Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Scientists. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Scientists by Albert Hubbard. Chapter 9, Part 2. When the brother and sister had followed the subject of astronomy as far as Ferguson had followed it, and knew all that he knew, they thought they surely would be content. Progress depends upon continually being dissatisfied. Now Ferguson aggravated them by his limitations. In their music they amused, animated, and inspired the fashionable idlers. William gave lessons to his private pupils, led his orchestra, played the organ and harpsichord, and managed to make ends meet, and would have gotten reasonably rich had he not invested his spare cash in lenses, brass tubes, eyepieces, specula, and other such trifles, and stood most of the night out on the lawn peering at the sky. He had been studying stars for 7 years before the Bath that he amused awoke to the fact that there was a genius among them, and this genius was not the idolized Beau Nash whose statue adorned the pump room. No, it was the man whose back they saw at the concerts. During all these years Herschel had worked alone, and he had scarcely ever mentioned the subject of astronomy with any one save his sister. One night, however, he had moved his telescope into the middle of the street to get away from the shadows of the houses. A doctor who had been out to answer a midnight call stopped at the unusual sight and asked if he might look through the instrument. Permission was courteously granted. The next day the doctor called on the astronomer to thank him for the privilege of looking through a better telescope than his own. The doctor was Sir William Watson, an amateur astronomer and all-round scientist, and member of the Royal Society of London. Herschel had held himself high. He had not gossiped of his work with the populace, cheapening his thought by diluting it for cheap people. Watson saw that Herschel, working alone, isolated, had surpassed the schools. There is a nugget of wisdom in Ibsen's remark, "The strongest man is he who stands alone," and Kipling's paraphrase, "He travels the fastest who travels alone." The chance acquaintance of Herschel and Watson soon ripened into a very warm friendship. Herschel amused the neurotics, Watson dosed and blistered them, both for a consideration. Each had a beautiful contempt for the society they served. Watson's father was of the purple, while Herschel's was of the people. But both men belonged to the aristocracy of intellect. Watson introduced Herschel into the select scientific circle of London, where his fine reserve and dignity made their due impress. Herschel's first paper to the Royal Society, presented by Dr. Watson, was on the periodical star in Colossetti. The members of the Society, always very jealous and suspicious of outsiders, saw they had a thinker to deal with. Someone carried the news to Bath. A great astronomer was now among them. About this time Horace Walpole said, "Mr. Herschel will content me if, instead of 1,000,000 worlds, he can discover me 13 colonies well inhabited by men and women, and can annex them to the crown of Great Britain in lieu of those it has lost beyond the Atlantic." Bath society now took up astronomy as a fad, and fashionable ladies named the planets both backward and forward from a blackboard list set up in the pump house by Fanny Burney, the clever one. Herschel was invited to give popular lectures on the music of the spheres. Herschel's music parlours were besieged by good people who wanted to make engagements with him to look through his telescope. One good woman gave the year, month, day, hour, and minute of her birth, and wanted her fortune told. Poor Herschel declined, saying he knew nothing of astronomy, but could give her lessons in music if desired. In answer to the law of supply and demand, thus proving the efficacy of prayer, an itinerant astronomer came down from London and set up a 5-foot telescope on the parade, and solicited the curious ones at twopence a peep. This itinerant interested the populace by telling them a few stories about the stars that were not recorded in Ferguson, and passed out his cards, showing where he could be consulted as a fortune-teller during the day. Herschel was once passing by this street astronomer, who was crying his wares, and a sudden impulse coming over him to see how bad the man's lens might be, he stopped to take a peep at a satellite. He handed out the usual twopence, but the owner of the telescope loftily passed it back, saying, "I takes no fee from a fellow philosopher." This story went the rounds, and when it reached London it had been amended thus: Charles Fox was taking a ramble at Bath, ran across William Herschel at work, and mistaking him for an itinerant, the great statesman stopped, peeped through the aperture, and then passing out a twopence, moved along blissfully unaware of his error, for Herschel, being a perfect gentleman, would not embarrass the great man by refusing his copper. When Herschel was asked if the story was true, he denied the whole fabric, which the knowing one said was further proof of his gentlemanly instincts, for a true gentleman will always lie under two conditions: first, to save a woman's honour, and second, to save a friend from embarrassment. As a profession, astrology has proved a better investment than astronomy. Astronomy has nothing to offer but abstract truth, and those who love astronomy must do so for truth's sake. Astronomical discoveries cannot be covered by copyright or patent, nor can any new worlds be claimed as private property and financed by stock companies, frenzied or otherwise. Astrology, on the other hand, relates to love affairs, vital statistics, gold mines, misplaced jewels, and lost opportunities. Yet in this year of grace, 1905, Boston newspapers carry a column devoted to announcements of astrologers, while the Cambridge Astronomical Observatory never gets so much as a mention from one year's end to the other. Besides that, astronomers have to be supported by endowment, mendicancy, while astrologers are paid for their prophecies by the people whose destinies they invent. This shows us how far as a nation we have travelled on the stony road of science. Science, forsooth! Oh yes, of course, science. Bang, bang, bang. In the month of March, in 1791, Herschel, by the discovery of Uranus, found his place as a fixed star among the world's great astronomers. Years before this, William and Caroline had figured it out that there must be another planet in our system in order to account plausibly for the peculiar ellipses of the others. That is to say, they felt the influence of this seventh planet. Its attractive force was realized, but where it was they could not tell. Its discovery by Herschel was quite accidental. He was sweeping the heavens for comets when this star came within his vision. Others had seen it too, but had classified it as a vagrant fixed star. It was the work of Herschel to discover that it was not a fixed star, but had a defined and distinct orbit that could be calculated. To look up at the heavens and pick out a star that could only be seen with a telescope, pick it out of millions and ascertain its movement, seems like finding the proverbial needle in a haystack. The present method of finding asteroids and comets by means of photography is simple and easy. The plate is exposed in a frame that moves by clockwork with the earth, so as to keep the same field of stars steady on the glass. After 2, 3, or 4 hours exposure, the photograph will show the fixed stars, but the planets, asteroids, and comets will reveal themselves as a white streak of light, showing plainly where the sitters moved. Herschel had to watch each particular star in person, whereas the photographic lens will watch 1,000. How close and persistent an observer a man must be who, watching one star at a time, discovers the one in a million that moves is apparent. Chance, surely, must also come to his aid and rescue if he succeeds. Herschel found his moving star, and at first mistook it for a comet. Later, he and Caroline were agreed that it was in very truth their long looked for planet. There are no proprietary rights in newly discovered worlds. The reward is in the honor of the discovery, just as the best recompense for a good deed lies in having done it. The Royal Society was the recording station, as Kiel, Greenwich, and Harvard are now. Herschel made haste to get his new world on record through his kind neighbor, Dr. Watson. The Royal Society gave out the information, and soon various other telescopes corroborated the discovery made by the Bath musician. Herschel christened his new discovery Georgium Sidus, in honor of the king, but the star belonged as much to Germany and France as to England, and astronomers abroad scouted the idea of peppering the heavens with the names of nobodies. Several astronomers suggested the name Herschel if the discoverer would consent, but this he would not do. Dr. Bode then named the new star Uranus, and Uranus it is, although perhaps with any other name it would shine as bright. Herschel was 43 years old when he discovered Uranus. He was still a professional musician and an amateur astronomer. But it did not require much arguing on the part of Dr. Watson when he presented Herschel's name for membership in the Royal Society, for that most respectable body of scholars to at once pass favorably on the nomination. As one member, in seconding the motion, put it, "Herschel honors us in accepting this membership quite as much as we do him in granting it." And so the next paper presented by Herschel to the Royal Society appears on the record signed William Herschel, F.R.S., being a Fellow of the Royal Society. Some time afterwards it was to appear William Herschel, F.R.S., LL.D., Edinburgh, meaning he was awarded Doctor of Laws by Edinburgh University. And then Sir William Herschel, F.R.S., LL.D., D.C.L., Oxon, meaning he had been awarded Doctor of Civil Laws by Oxford University. George III, in about the year 1782, had invited his distinguished Hanoverian countryman to become an attaché of the court with the title of Astronomer to the King. The Astronomer Royal in charge of the Greenwich Observatory was one Dr. Maskelyne, a man of much learning, a stickler for the fact, but with a mustard-seed imagination. Being asked his opinion of Herschel, he assured the company thus: "Herschel is a great musician, a great musician." Afterwards, Maskelyne explained that the reason Herschel saw more than other astronomers was because he had made himself a better telescope. One real secret of Herschel's influence seems to have been his fine enthusiasm. He worked with such vim, such animation, that he radiated light on every side. He set others to work, and his love for astronomy as a science created a demand for telescopes, which he himself had to supply. It does not seem that he cared especially for money. All he made he spent for new apparatus. He had a force of about a dozen men making telescopes. He worked with them in blouse and overalls, and not one of his workmen excelled him as a machinist. The king bought several of his telescopes for from 100 to 300 pounds each, and presented them to universities and learned societies throughout the world. One fine telescope was presented to the University of Göttingen, and Herschel was sent in person to present it. He was received with the greatest honors, and scientists and musicians vied with one another to do him homage. In 1782, Herschel and his sister gave up their musical work and moved from Bath to quarters provided for them near Windsor Castle. Herschel's salary was then the modest sum of £200 a year. Caroline was honored with the title Assistant to the King's Astronomer, with a stipend of £50 a year. It will thus be seen that the kingly idea of astronomy had not travelled far from what it was when every really respectable court had a retinue of singers, musicians, clowns, dancers, palmists, and scientists to amuse the people somewhat ironically called nobility. King George III paid his cook, master of the kennels, chaplain, and astronomer the same amount. The father of Richard Brinsley Sheridan was elocutionist to the king, and was paid a like sum. When Dr. Watson heard that Herschel was about to leave Bath, he wrote, "Never bought king honour so cheap." It was nominated in the bond that Herschel should act as guide to the heavens for the diversification of visitors whenever his Majesty wills it. But it was also provided that the astronomer should be allowed to carry on the business of making and selling his telescopes. Herschel's enthusiasm for his beloved science never abated, but often his imagination outran his facts. Great minds divine the thing first. They see it with their inward eye. Yet there may be a danger in this, for in one's anxiety to prove what he first only imagined, small proof suffices. Thus Herschel was for many years sure that the moon had an atmosphere and was inhabited. He thought that he had seen clear through the Milky Way and discovered empty space beyond. He calculated distances, and announced how far Castor was from Pollux. He even made a guess as to how long it took for a gaseous nebula to resolve itself into a planetary system. He believed the sun was a molten mass of fire, a thing that many believed until they saw the incandescent electric lamp, and in various other ways made daring prophecies which science has not only failed to corroborate, but which we now know to be errors. But the intensity of his nature was both his virtue and his weakness. Men who do nothing and say nothing are never ridiculous. Those who hope much, believe much, and love much make mistakes. Constant effort and frequent mistakes are the stepping stones of genius. In all, Herschel contributed 67 important papers to the proceedings of the Royal Society, and in one of these, which was written in his 80th year, he says, "My enthusiasm has occasionally led me astray, and I wish now to correct a statement which I made to you 28 years ago." He then enumerates some particular statement about the height of mountains in the moon, and corrects it. Truth was more to Herschel than consistency. Indeed, the earnestness, purity of purpose, and simplicity of his mind stamp him as one of the world's great men. At Windsor he built a 2-story observatory. In the winter time, every night when the stars could be seen was sacred. No matter how cold the weather, he stood and watched, while down below the faithful Caroline sat and recorded the observations that he called down to her. Caroline was his confidant, adviser, secretary, servant, friend. She had a telescope of her own, and when her brother did not need her services, she swept the heavens on her own account for maverick comets. In her work she was eminently successful, and 5 comets at least are placed to her credit on the honor roll by right of priority. Her discoveries were duly forwarded by her brother to the Royal Society for record. Later, the King of Prussia was to honor her with a gold medal, and several learned societies elected her an honorary member. When Herschel reached the discreet age of 50, he married the worthy Mrs. John Pitt, former wife of a London merchant. It is believed that the marriage was arranged by the king in person, out of his great love for both parties. At any rate, Miss Burney thought so. Miss Burney was keeper of the royal wardrobe, at the same salary that Herschel had been receiving, £200 a year. She also took charge of the court gossip, with various volunteer assistants. "Gold as well as stars glitters for astronomers," said little Miss Burney. "Mrs. Pitt is very rich, meek, quiet, rather pretty, and quite unobjectionable. But poor Caroline!" It nearly broke her heart. William was her idol. She lived but for him. Now she seemed to be replaced. She moved away into a modest cottage of her own, resolved that she would not be an encumbrance to anyone. She thought she was going into a decline, and would not live long anyway. She was so pale and slight that Miss Burney said it took 2 of her to make a shadow. But we get a glimpse of Caroline's energy when we find her writing home, explaining how she had just painted her house inside and out with her own hands. Things are never so bad as they seem. It was not very long before William was sending for Caroline to come and help him out with his mathematical calculations. Later, when a fine boy baby arrived in the Herschel solar system, Caroline forgave all and came to take care of what she called the Herschel planetoid. She loved this baby as her own, and all the pent-up motherhood in her nature went out to the little Sir John Herschel, the knighthood having been conferred on him by Caroline before he was a month old. Mrs. Herschel was beautiful and amiable, and she and Caroline became genuine sisters in spirit. Each had her own work to do. They were not in competition, save in their love for the baby. As the boy grew, Caroline took upon herself the task of teaching him astronomy, quite to the amusement of the father and mother. Fanny Burney now comes with a little flung off nebula to the effect that Herschel is quite the happiest man in the kingdom. There is a most charming little biography of Caroline Herschel, written by the good wife of Sir John Herschel, wherein some very gentle foibles are laid bare, and where, at the same time, tribute is paid to a great and beautiful spirit. The idea that Caroline was not going to live long after the marriage of her brother was greatly exaggerated. She lived to be 98, a century lacking 2 years. Her mind was bright to the last. When 90, she sang at a concert given for the benefit of an old ladies' home. At 96, she danced a minuet with the King of Prussia, and requested that worthy not to introduce her as the woman astronomer, because, you know, I was only the assistant of my brother. William Herschel died in his 84th year, with his fame at full, honored, respected, beloved. Sir John Herschel, his son, was worthy to be called the son of his father. He was an active worker in the field of science, a strong yet gentle man, with no jealousy nor whim in his nature. His life was full of the docility of a sage and the innocence of a child. John Herschel died at Collingwood, May 11th, 1871, and his dust is now resting in Westminster Abbey, close by the grave of England's famous scholar, Sir Isaac Newton. End of section 10. Recording by Steve Chilvers, Norwich, England.